gonna make sure we exist everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Boom, 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 boom. All right. Hey, people are popping in. Hey, if you are on here live, oh, there we go. Leave us a comment. There we got a no, so we know we're on YouTube. Tom, first commenter. Well
I,
done. All right. There we go. I'm gonna make sure it's working on Facebook.
Fredonia.
Hey, Joseph. Boom, 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 boom. There we go. Excellent. It looks like it is showing up over. Yep, we got people coming in from all around. Now, while you're all popping in, if you have questions that you want to add to the Q&A, though, y'all did not fail to send plenty of questions, but feel free to put them in the chat in whichever medium you're using. If you put question at the front, then I can star them and save them. Those of you hopping in and sharing around, welcome. We have plenty of people. I know they're coming in or watching this later from that were in our Christmas group. But anyone joining this, if you get intrigued and weren't part of the whole walk through Advent with Dom, the next month or so, you could still go join in to grab all the visual lectures and our conversations and such about it. And but not just that, because so many of you enjoyed it. And I was amazed how many different church groups, book groups, discussion groups were using it.
Yeah,
We're going to be doing some something similar for Easter. We're going to be calling it Easter stories, following the same vibe. But one of the unique things we're going to do at Easter, and you can go to easterwithcrossan.com, a website I finished building 10 minutes ago after having an exploding tire this morning. If you go there, you can join up. And one of the cool things we're going to do this time is we're going to record the lecture parts in advance, edit them, and then when the class kicks off right at the beginning of Lent, all 4 of the visual lectures will be available, which we hope will be a perk for a number of people. If you are an individual, and some of you were like, I would have had better questions if I wasn't still processing it. Well, you can watch in advance, send questions. If you were one of the groups and you go, oh, well, here's our schedule, and here's when we would do it during Advent, and then it's hard to know how long it'll be and all that kind of stuff, then you'll have the main lectures right at the beginning of Lent. And then in addition to that, we'll also have live Q&As throughout. So you can join the Q&As live. You and your group could send in your questions in advance, and that kind of thing. It's a slight modification because Dom, like I, are very excited to test all the ways we can use technology in the present to engage around some of the best scholarship, and then allow individuals and groups to use it in the best way for them and their community. So that's what we're going to be testing this time. So if you go to easterwithcrossan.com, and I didn't fail in building the website rather quickly over the last couple days, then you can sign up. And tonight, before I go to bed, you'll get the welcome email, because that is not finished writing yet. But I had an exploding tire this morning while doing drop off. So I also have horrible hair, but we don't have to talk about that. It's got sweat and rain while messing with tire vibe.
I'm losing mine, so don't worry. I have a problem with my hair. There's no there.
It happens.
Yeah, I'm ready now. I have all 4 of them ready, and this week I'm going to record them, so you'll have them by February the 1st, Deo Valente.
Oh yeah. So there we go. Now with that, we can jump in to having some fun doing some Q&A. And I'm glad. Hello to everyone. Y'all have been sharing in the chat where you're from. And quite a few of you I got to meet this past weekend when I was at St. Simon's Island for what used to be the January Adventure, now Southern Lights Conference. And Dom, I have to say, you have some very, very kind fan club members who...
I love St. Simon's Island. It's a lovely weekend.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. And they were very excited to hear that we're going to be doing this again around the Easter stories. So maybe the first question, and there, you would, I'm sure you're not surprised about this, but there were quite a few questions sent in specifically about the cross and resurrection. And knowing we're going to be spending quite a bit of time digging it in, maybe you can share just a bit about what you hope to do in digging into the Easter stories that you do in the beautiful book that you and Sarah did, but to give people an idea of what happens when you take the historical matrix that you used in dealing with the Advent stories, and then looking at the Easter stories. What are the big ideas or themes that we can anticipate wrestling with?
Well, for example, if you focus on crucifixion, I'm trying to use crucifixion, resurrection as a hyphenated term. We have split them and ruined both, to be quite frank with you. There's historical questions. Why did Jesus go up to Jerusalem that Passover? If he went every year, which I doubt a day laborer from Galilee could do, but if he went every year, what happened that year that never happened previous ones? If he only went that time, why did he go? Did he go up there for vicarious satisfaction, or to give a model of martyrdom? And then if you watch what happened, I'm not reading his mind, I'm watching what happened. In other words, he gets out of the city to Bethany every night, which is very smart. That's what I would do too if I was trying not to get crucified on Sunday night. Get out of there to your friends at Bethany, and then he's protected every day by the crowds. So no, every action I can see from Jesus is trying to avoid getting himself killed. Of course, he knows the danger. He knows what happened to John. So that part, we have a fair amount of history. Now, here's the second part of it. The crucial difference, why I talked about Easter stories. We talked about Advent stories because there was Matthew and Luke, of course, two different stories, not just... Here are the two stories of Easter. I'm using Easter now deliberately. Are the Eastern story, Eastern Christianity, I mean, and the Western story, which are profoundly, radically diverse. In the Western tradition, Jesus comes out from the tomb, radiant, triumphant, looking a little bit like a buffed stud coming out of the gym, to be honest with you, quite gorgeous, muscular, but alone. Alone. There's cowering guards, maybe they see, maybe they don't, but there's nobody else there. The Eastern tradition has him coming out basically from the very beginning, from the year 700, with Adam and Eve. Now, Adam and Eve ain't two guys from the Old Testament. They're the human race. So what on earth does it mean? I mean, I can imagine somebody somehow coming back, as it were, from the dead. But taking Adam and Eve with him, I don't think I can get that in there anywhere literally, to be honest with you. So these are the two stories we have to look at. And in the background, we have to ask the difference between ascension, which was an individual going up to God or the gods. Caesar did it, Romulus did it, Moses did it. And resurrection, which was a sort of a cosmic justice for the human race. Those are radically different visions. They're both metaphorical, but metaphors can be very different. It's very different to say the president is a chicken and the president is an eagle. They're both metaphors, but they ain't the same metaphor. So there's a huge amount of unfinished business, especially for the West. And for any theologian in the West who's talking about resurrection and doesn't seem to know that the East has a totally different theology, iconography, it's like talking about as if Europe or the English speaking world was all the people there were. It's just wrong. So the stories is to try and see what happens when you look at these two different stories: Western tradition, Eastern tradition, individual, resurrection, or is it just ascension, and then resurrection itself? And
Mm.
there's huge questions
Yeah.
behind that.
So that I think will be real helpful. A question that came up repeatedly in all the different and asked a bunch of different ways by members from the Advent class is about your own relationship and how it changed with Scripture. You were self-conscious and told a number of stories about how in the academic study of Scripture you have this tension that so many of the individuals and communities that are invested in it have a confessional location. You drew a contrast, for example, between your own work and Raymond Brown. Both of you come out of the Catholic Church, but you have a different relationship with the kind of boundary markings of that
Yes.
confessional community. And I think people in the group, plenty of people have different religious orientations or not, but are fascinated with the kind of academic study of Scripture. How do you, what are the different ways you see those tensions playing out, and how has it changed in your own life as the way the academic historical study impacts the way you think about whatever we talk about when we talk about God, faith, spirituality, and such?
Uh, I may have said this before, so excuse me if you already heard it, but part of it was something I had nothing to do with. I simply grew up in Roman Catholic Ireland. I wasn't aware of being Roman Catholic. Roman Catholicism was the wallpaper of the country. I mean, it was what held the country together against England, as it were. So it was political. But, when I was growing up in the 30s and 40s, it was relatively quiet. So I was never pounded over the head with literalism or fundamentalism. It just wasn't there. I wasn't being particularly wise about it, just wasn't there. We knew, of course, there was the Pope, but the Irish always took the Pope with a little grain of salt. He was over there, and of course, of course, of course. The other part of it was, and I've said this so often, I'm sorry if I'm repeating it, by pure luck. Um, my father was a bank manager in Ballybuffet in Donegal, the closest school. Small towns didn't have their own high schools. Off I went to a boarding school. So did everyone else. I mean, don't think of an elite boarding school of England. But we had the education left over by the receding tide of British imperialism. They had gone in the 20s, but they had left their education system. So I had a magnificent education, as good as I would have got in Eton or anywhere else in England. 5 years of Greek, 5 years of Latin. It was taken for granted. It was nothing special, honestly. So when I went into the monastery and they said, well, you got all this Latin and Greek, you're going to become a professor, sure, whatever. Somehow I had got used to reading Virgil and Homer before I literally ever saw a New Testament or a Bible. I mean that literally, because in Roman Catholic tradition, the big book is not the Bible, it's the Missal, which is a collection, of course, from all over the Bible, Psalms and everything's from the Bible, but it's sort of saying, this is our book. It's a very political, polemical statement. This is our big book. So I never had to fight my way out of literalism. When we were reading Virgil, and nobody said, now please, students, don't take literally that Caesar is divine, whatever you do. No. We heard those stories, and I suppose as teenagers we took them with like everything else, with a large amount of maybe. So I just, by good luck, honestly, not by the wisdom of anything, I avoided a huge amount. And it was only when I came to this country and really started working with the Jesus Seminar that I had to learn a lot of these people, my colleagues, are fighting their way out of fundamentalism. And the ultimate trap is anti-fundamentalism. In other words, if somebody says Jesus is divine, I'm going to say, no, he wasn't. Whereas I would say, I wonder what they meant in the first century by saying anyone was divine. And I know they said Caesar was before they ever got to Jesus. So I automatically put it into that matrix, not because of great wisdom or anything else, honestly. And I had to kind of learn that other people had to fight their way out of that. I remember often talking to Bob Funk, and he was fighting his way out of it. And I could kind of go very calmly with the whole thing. I didn't see a problem with Jesus being divine in a world where Caesar could be divine. It never occurred to me how could a Jewish peasant be divine? I thought that was quite a challenge to Caesar. So my whole background really went at it. I know I disappoint the media a lot of times by not being able to say, "Oh, I lost my faith. I left the priesthood. I left the monastery. I lost everyone." Then one night Jesus came to me and said, "Get on with." No, it would be much more dramatic. It never happened. It never happened. The Bible simply made sense to me from the first day I read it.
Mm-hmm.
But I read it historically, but I took it very seriously, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually fascinating because one of the questions got sent in from Samantha. She said that her grandparents were in the Advent class and said, "Oh, I bet you'll like this. You're a history major." And then she sent an email and said, as someone whose family didn't raise me in a religious context, and it was in a very much more secular space, the spiritual religious questions are abounding, but I didn't have the baggage. And she said, I find it fascinating how many people have a hard time hearing Dom outside of their religious context, because I've never wanted to take the Bible seriously until I realized that the stories that we were discussing are wrestling with the big questions we face as a species. And I think it's important to share that story because the number of people that grow up with the kind of religious Bible baggage that you have to get over is changing, and recognizing how the historical textual resources can actually help us think again, right, about these texts as making propositions, calling, giving a vision and such, that in some sense it's too beautiful and powerful to trivialize with the odd debates that are that kind of anti-modern wrestling with scripture is generated.
And some of that, in a way, is almost deliberately avoiding the big questions that are lurking there. It's much easier to argue, say, about virginal conception or something from a biological point of view, because we'll get nowhere. If you take it literally, you can't prove it or disprove it. I remember when I first read John Meyer, the late lamented John Meyer's first volume, and he said, well, Jesus is God, and we cannot discuss that historically, or Jesus is the Son of God, we cannot discuss that historically. He's right. Of course you can. That's the theological premise. But you could discuss whether Joseph was the father. That's an historical question. You might say, I don't know. You might say that, but that's still an historical answer. We don't have enough data. But you raise the question. So if you approach it historically, my own slogan is, if you get bad history, you're going to get bad theology. If you get good history, you might just get good theology.
Yeah. So one of the questions that has driven your work is reading one of your books. One of I think a great title that if it didn't already exist, I'd want to borrow it, is How to Read the Bible and Still Be a Christian. I think I would go write a book if I just had that book title so that I could tell people about it. But there in books like God and Empire, and in the last week that we'll be looking at going forward and such, there's this the one of the big challenges to faith in the present is the nature of violence and evil, and what would it mean to take Scripture seriously? And I think because your own religious inheritance and academic intuitions don't lead you to need to do a cover-up story where there's a seamless one answer running through Scripture, that you can simultaneously wrestle with divine violence and scapegoating and such, and wrestle with it in a way that can inspire living in the present. But for those that may not have that same intuition in it, like how do you begin to read the Bible and still be a Christian? Different variations of that question came in from people and said, and then how do you do it if you aren't a super nerd and dedicated your life to it like Dom?
Yes. Yeah. So that title, by the way, when I first suggested it to my editor, my then editor at Harper, he said, okay. Normally you'd have to argue with it. I want to do this, I want to do that. Send me a proposal. Let me see your first chapter. No, you got it. The title did it. Basically, I understand that the historical Jesus is the norm of the Bible. I mean, it's something so obvious. I was kind of embarrassed to write a book about it. We are called Christians. Nobody called us Biblians or Biblicists or anything. We're called Christians. And that is Christ, the title, the messianic title of Jesus, the human being, Jesus of Nazareth. So basically then, if you're a Christian, that is the norm of the whole Bible, Jesus. So I use him not only for a problem in the Old Testament, but for the most violent book in the entire Bible, the book of Revelation. Jesus is the norm of the Bible. He's the norm of the book of Revelation. This ain't Jesus. This is the Antichrist coming back on a horse, to slaughter as the final solution. So no, it seems to me that's obvious. When evangelicals said, what would Jesus do? They got it perfectly right. They didn't say, what does the Bible say? What WDB? Oh, that's bad. WDBS. That would be bad. What does the Bible say? I guess you wouldn't want to say WD. You wouldn't want that slogan, come to think of it. Okay, we scratch.
You don't want to put it on your bracelet? Is that?
I don't think you better do that one. No. But again, it's important. And when Muslims say that we are the people of the book, no, we're not. We're the people with the book. We're the people of the person. The person is Jesus of Nazareth, and what we think about Jesus of Nazareth and everything about Jesus of Nazareth. So I have never felt that I'm wandering around in the Bible trying to figure, do I go with Deuteronomy? Do I go with the book of Revelation? I have a kind of a lodestar that helps. Now, this is the question, though. Jesus has the privilege, as an individual person, of accepting martyrdom, not fighting back. Not every group, not every family, not every group, and not every nation can accept martyrdom. That's what we really have to face. So if you ask me, for example, do the Ukrainians have the right to resist? My answer is yes. They should know what's happening, because here's the ultimate problem. It's a species-wide problem. And I'm quoting something from Render Unto Caesar, so allow me to do it. As a species, we are a evolutionary anomaly. I mean, if I looked at it benignly, I'd say we're an evolutionary problem. If I looked at it malignly, I'd say we're an evolutionary joke. We are a social species with individual wills. Now, that's no way to run a social species. All the other successful ones, like the termites and the ants or the bees, nobody gets up in the morning and says, I'm to heck with this honey business, I'm staying home. We're pulled towards individualism. That's our glory. And we're pulled towards community. That's also our glory. And somehow or other, we have to maneuver between those two things as a species. So it's not that we have an original sin as our problem. We have an original state. We are this anomaly. So we have to maneuver our way through this. We have to work socially. We have to work individually in some kind of tension. So that's where I start with. Now, I'm not surprised, therefore, when I find it in the Bible. Of course, I think if it wasn't in the Bible, then it would be a phony book. It would be like kind of, some kind of kid stuff. So I find it there. Now, I find somebody like Jesus as an individual, as a witness. Martyr, as you know, is the Greek word for a witness. Jesus is a witness to nonviolence. As in the parable in John's gospel, that's what he tells Pilate. I don't think he ever had a conversation with Pilate. But anyway, he says to Pilate, my kingdom ain't like yours, buddy. If it was, my guys would be in here kicking butt to get me out. That's the basic translation of John. Chapter 19 or somewhere. No, that's Jesus. We have a species problem. And every time we decide, because yes, we have to do it, I couldn't see any way out except violence, we are taking one more step towards the unsustainability of the human species. That's what we have to recognize. And we already have more than enough weapons right now to make it an unsustainable species. So I'm caught between the ideal of Jesus, which I understand the witness and the power of that witness. And I don't say, well, that was lovely, that we just forget about him now, get on with life. No, because I think it warns us. It warns us that it took us 3,000 years to get from a stone weapon to an iron sword. I'm sorry, it took us about 3 million years to get us to an iron sword, but only 3,000 to get to the atom bomb. We're getting faster and faster. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina was 19-something, and now we have a stealth bomber. None of that is any cheap cracks about the military or anything else. It's simply asking us to look at our species and our record since we left Africa. I'm talking about Homo sapiens. I love the irony in that name, by the way, the wise Homo. Homo sapiens, somebody loves oxymoron. The wise Homo left Africa 70,000 plus years ago, and basically, as I see it, declared war on the world. And now the price tag's coming in for the environment, for other species, and for ourselves. So I see that as the problem, rather than if somebody attacks me, can I defend myself? Because the answer is yes, I will. Of course. There's no point in saying you won't, because you will. But that doesn't solve the problem. We are, as a species, we are addicted to violence.
Yeah.
And it's an addiction. So I see it kind of trip like, a kid of 16 with a cigarette. What's going to happen if the kid smokes the first cigarette? Nothing. It's this. Why about the second, the third, the fourth? An addiction is terribly hard to get rid of, because you have to imagine a whole different you and a whole different universe.
Yeah, you mentioning that, it reminds me of one of my favorite books. Marjorie Suhaki, who's a process philosopher and theologian, has a book called "The Fall to Violence," which is an evolutionary theological reflection on the question of violence. And in it, one of the things she emphasizes is our inability to be honest about our biological inheritance, and our socio-cultural inheritance, and the institutional frameworks that we've generated. Helps us remain naive about the problem of violence, that you kind of have all three legs to the story of violence. And we end up with these doctrines in the church or in different religious traditions that kind of flatten it when the problems we face actually require thinking through how, becoming more aware of what we inherit biologically, thinking of how we are born into and then perform cultural expectations and inheritance, being strategic about how we gather and organize as institutions and such. And that so often religious traditions develop their ideas about this at a time all three components weren't as visible and aggressive and clear about the problem. So if we and then if we look back at the sacred text and read them again, right, using the historical matrix and stuff that you've talked about, we see that Jesus's own way of inheriting his tradition and the way he's faithful comes to challenge us at not taking all those elements seriously.
There's one thing, again, this is kind of a commercial message for Renrod to Caesar. There's a whole couple of chapters in there about Josephus. Let's forget about Jesus. It doesn't exist as a moment. Between the Great Revolt in 4 BC, the death of Herod the Great, when about 2,000 people were crucified in Jerusalem, and the War of 66 to 74, in those 70 years, Josephus, through gritted teeth, admits, and he doesn't want to, that there were massive experiments with nonviolent resistance. Now, not nonviolent, nonviolent resistance, like sit-down strikes, almost to use our language, that they were experimenting with that. And Josephus tells us about it because he's more annoyed with that than with out-and-out war. He describes those people as having less blood on their hands but more impure souls, because he can't figure out nonviolent resistance, sitting down in front of the procurator or the legate from Syria and saying, we're not moving, back off. They were inventing, I think, nonviolent resistance. Now, to be honest with you, forget Jesus again, I really wish that it had succeeded, because nobody could wish the War of 66 to 74 on anyone's homeland. So, and of course, later, that was what was decided. The ironic thing is that the Jewish tradition went towards nonviolence when the Christian tradition was just accommodating Constantine. They flipped, as it were. So it's not that it's not there, but it wasn't individuals just. It was organized stuff, say against Caligula's statue and stuff like that. So we have all the evidence. It's there. It's in Josephus. And I was putting Jesus's vision of nonviolence in the matrix of his time. After 4 BCE, by the time he was born, that's what he grew up in. The Romans had been there in his backyard in 4 BCE by the time he was born in Sepphoris and near Nazareth. So I understand that. That makes sense to me in terms of Irish history. Between a war, that's when you ask, is there other options? Are we ready just for the next round? So I see that as a specific problem, a species problem, I should say, as well.
Yeah. But there are in the setup for the Christmas stories, you mentioned briefly a connection between the way you understand the historical matrix and kind of the 4 arrows and the way it connects to our species story, scientific matrix. And there are a couple people that were interested in you developing it enough to think with it. My favorite was Bert said, it looked like nerdy catnip, and I would just like enough so I could write them both down and think with it later. And I said to myself, if I ever said anything to someone and they said it sounds like nerdy catnip, I would want them. I would want to expound on it.
Okay, let me maybe. Here's what's fascinating. This is just to get into it. We say with the Big Bang, what was created with the Big Bang was like a quadrant: matter, energy, time, and place. I think of that as like a quadrant, if you want to think of it as a cross: matter, energy, time, and place. Like 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and o'clock. Now, it seems to me that every major achievement we've ever done, every creativity that human beings do, including, for example, Jesus, has the same kind of a sub-matrix in there. There's tradition, vision, time, and place. Tradition, I simply mean by tradition what everyone tells you, this is the way it is. Uh, Steve Jobs inventing the phone, for example, doesn't have to invent the telephone and all the other stuff. He just has to have a vision of how the tradition could be readjusted. And if the time is right and the place is right, it works. And if the time is not right and the place is not right, we never hear of it again, probably. So any creativity, I'm not just making this some kind of a theological, any creativity works in that matrix of tradition, energy, a tradition, vision, time, and place. And I kind of see that as a little miniature of the Big Bang, the small bang. There's somebody who has a vision. And by a vision, I mean a way of taking what's there and turning it on its head, turning it inside out, doing it this way. But the time and place have to be right. So to understand Jesus, for example, historically, I have to look at the tradition, his own Jewish tradition. I have to look at his own angle of vision on it, however you explain that. But then you have to look at the time. You can't leave that out. The time is the Romanization of the homeland, and the place, Galilee under Antipas. So you put that together, and even as a small little entry into the evolutionary matrix that we're all in, whether we like it or not. By the way, the same way as we're in gravity, whether we like it or not. It doesn't make the slightest difference whether you like gravity, no gravity, or anything else. I look out my window here where Sarah and I are living, and we've oak trees outside, and there's squirrels all the time having a gorgeous time out there. They never fall. Somehow they know what not to do. I don't think they've figured out gravity, but they know not to do certain things. So evolution is operational on us, whether we like it or not, or deny it or not. But that's one little glimpse where I saw it, the Big Bang, sort of as a miniature of any creation.
There are a couple of questions about the between, in a sense. Most of your academic career, you were a leader in the historical Jesus movement within the Society of Biblical Literature, within a lot of the work at the Jesus Seminar, and this kind of thing. When you think of the historical matrix of Jesus and the multiplicity of kind of his attempts at historically reconstructing, Martha asked, are there particular features of the scholarship that have enough of consensus that, regardless of where you may exist or not exist from a confessional space, these are some of the features of Jesus's historical matrix, teachings, actions, and such that the scholar has to take seriously when doing that work?
Okay. I think in my own case, and therefore in the scholarly transitions, we have gone through a series of steps, each of which is cumulative. It takes the past one with us. I think when we started off, there was a tendency to read Jesus to within, let's call it the Christian tradition. There you had it all. We had all these stories about Jesus, the liturgy, and everything else. And of course, I first learned about Jesus, as you know, in Ireland, from the Rosary and the Stations of the Cross and things like that, not from the Bible. But you could see Jesus in a totally Christian situation. Now, what happened to me was in 1960, I was in Rome doing 2 years of exegesis at the Biblical Institute, postdoctoral. This was 59 to 61. Gorgeous years to be in Rome, by the way. It was back on its feet, but not inundated with cars. In 1960, I was a chaplain with 40 other people to the Passion Play at Oberammergau. It was the second time, I think, obviously in 1940, shall we say, it wasn't on. And in 1950, it was on with Adenauer and Eisenhower present. So I saw it in 1960. It was the same ancient one that had been going on for 300 years. Same one Hitler saw in the 30s. all of a sudden, during that, now I didn't know the story, by the way. I didn't know we were going to end up with a crucifixion. But in the morning, the entire stage was filled with people shouting for Jesus, our Palm Sunday. Then you go to lunch, and after lunch you come back. The whole thing takes about 6 hours. After lunch you come back, and all of a sudden everyone's against Jesus. Now, honestly, for the first time, I knew the story. I was halfway through a doctorate over, halfway through 2 years at the Biblical Institute. So this is a crummy story. I don't know how the whole crowd changed. Oh yeah, I mean, I hear there's these bad priests and all the rest of it. But what happened during lunchtime? We went to lunch and all hell broke loose. So actually the first learned article in a learned journal I ever wrote was in Theological Studies, Jesuit journal, and it was called The Anti-Semitism and the New Testament. Anti-Semitism. It was coming, I was beginning to think, you can't just talk about Jesus within Christianity, he's within Judaism. Now, that's what's happening all around me, so I'm not even claiming, I have great insight. I was probably, cruising on a wave. So you had to move Jesus, whatever he was, let's call it messianic now, I wouldn't say Christian, within Judaism. And that pretty much worked, for me for the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, into the Jesus seminar. But then by the 90s, I was hearing all around me in America, watch how the historical matrix of your own time and place plays into it, that we were an empire. In fact, the bad, evil empire was gone. The Berlin Wall was down. We were the supreme empire. It was mono-imperialism. And people were saying, some sadly, some gladly, we're an empire. Get used to it. And I began to think, wait a minute. People were even saying we're the new Roman Empire. There was no opposition. Everything else was gone. Apparently, we were it. And I thought, well, why do we want to be the new Roman Empire when the old Roman Empire crucified our Jesus if you're Christian and burned down our city if you're Jewish? Why would we celebrate a new Roman Empire? And I began to think then, and other people were thinking it too, of course, at the same time, and for the same reasons. The Christian Jesus has to be within Judaism, has to be within the Roman occupation. You can't just leave that out. It's not the elephant in the room, it's the herd of elephants in the room. So now what happened to me then after that, and I think that's it, I hope that's where the scholarship is at the moment, that whole historical matrix has now to be put into the matrix of evolution itself. This is the final fourth stage, if you will, the fourth matrix. So that Jesus, Paul, the whole New Testament has to be understood, if you want to call it a Christian phenomenon for the moment, I won't argue that word for the moment, within Judaism, within Roman imperialism, Judaism, you haven't left Judaism, but within evolution itself. So it's a gathering matrix, and that's pretty much where I am at the moment, trying to understand it within history, of course, but thinking of history almost like a wave on the ocean of evolution. So you can't skip the ocean.
Yeah. So like if you take those kind of nestings of matrices and then think of some of the language or titles and such we think of Jesus, you wrestled with a number of them in the Christmas stories, and I'm sure it will happen again when we think of the Easter stories. One of the questions that came in that I find I'm guessing, I'm trying to guess what you're going to say, is around the concept of Messiah. And it seems to be that there, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, this eruption around the debate of one thinking of nesting that concept in apocalyptic Judaism, in the empire and all this kind of stuff, the concepts of Messiah, and then how Jesus understood his own way of being that occupying that vocation. How maybe lay out how you understand the idea of messiahship and Jesus, the historical Jesus relationship to it.
Okay. Uh, Basically, if you Jesus hasn't arrived yet. We're kind of looking at the Jewish tradition, at the biblical tradition before it, and of course, they were completely convinced that there was something radically wrong with the world because they believed that it was run by a God of justice and fairness and equity. And all they had to do was look around and ask what boot was on their national neck at the moment to know that it was not fair. They're basically their whole history, except for little interludes, maybe the Davidic period or the Maccabean period, there was always some empire because of where they were. They're the hinge of Africa, Europe, and Asia. They're the cockpit of empire. Every empire going east, west, north, south goes right through there. So it's not a safe place to be living, by the way. So they could have thought that someday we'll be an empire and do the same. They didn't. They began to think that maybe the world has to change. Now, from their point of view, the only one who could change the world was God. And since it was God's world, God should do it. Get with it. You're a mess. So the idea was that someday in the future, in days to come, blissfully unspecified, God would change the world into a place of justice and peace. And you could hear the anvil chorus as the swords were beaten into plowshares and the spears and the pruning hooks. The magnificent vision. But that came from a people who were battered down most of the time. But there would be a vision in the future. Now, inquiring minds wanted to know, first of all, when? Other inquiring minds wanted to know how. Would there be a leader down here on earth? Would God send an angel? Would it be a prophet? Would it be a warrior? All of that goes with the paraphernalia. Now, if you watch what's happening, they've gone to the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians. Persians are pretty good. Maybe things were getting better. No, you got Alexander's Greeks. Then you had the Syrians and the Egyptians using Israel as a battleground. And then you got the Romans. And I'm not making that up. You can read Daniel. Daniel knows the sweep. Where is this cleanup? Let me call it the great divine cleanup of the world, because that's a more humane term than eschatology. Eschatology is the great scholarly world to scare the living daylights out of everyone because it sounds like a rash or a disease or something. Eschatology. It simply means the great divine cleanup of the world. Mm-hmm. And why did there have to be a great divine cleanup? Because it's God's world and it's a lousy place to live. With all due respect, your Godship, you're not doing too well, This whole thing goes back to the factory. We need a recreation. So all of that's in the world. My friend and colleague, John Collins, said that probably the popular idea at the time of Jesus was that the Messiah would be a sort of a transcendental warrior. Yeah, he'd be a warrior, but he figured the angels would be needed as shock troops. He probably would go to war, but how could he take on the Romans without divine help? And then, as John says in his book, The Scepter and the Star, Jesus, however, didn't fit into that. Now, remember that I'm insisting that in the period between 4 and 66, and that's 70 years, there's massive controlled experimentation with nonviolent resistance, not nonviolence. The Romans loved nonviolence. They were all in favor of it. You got a medal for nonviolence. Nonviolent resistance was something else. So that's the localized matrix into which Jesus steps. Now, as far as I can tell, and I think there's a massive consensus of scholars on this one, and I respect scholarly consensus because they're miraculous. You want to see a miracle if you get a bunch of scholars to agree on anything, because we'll fight the 1% we don't agree on and ignore the 99 we do. But anyway, in that first century, the Romans are there. Now, what are we going to do about it? Jesus talks about, and here's the consensus, he talks about the rule of God. His term is the kingdom of God. And for some people, that's a kind of a male, old fashioned male title. So let's call it God's rule. It's sort of, the question would be, if God sat on Caesar's throne, what would it be like? What would the world be like if God really ran it down here? That's what it means. God's rule. You and I might say, what would a federal budget look like if Jesus, let's say, ran it up? That's the question. It's very much about this world. So God's rule is what he talks about. As far as we can tell, we have no good historical evidence that Jesus said, I'm the Messiah. But I have no problem, honestly, if people, said to one another, you think that guy's the Messiah? I do, but he ain't a warrior. No, he must be into this nonviolent resistance stuff. Because he's not acting like a warrior. He isn't. He really isn't, however you explain it. So I think Jesus probably would never have said, I'm the Messiah, because he'd spend the rest of the week explaining what type of Messiah he wasn't. Do you know what I mean? He's a different type of Messiah. Like if I'm reading a book in a plane, as I once was, and somebody next to me said, are you a Christian? And immediately in my mind, it comes, now, if I say yes, I'm going to spend the rest of the 2 hours getting to Denver explaining, no, I'm not that type of Christian. So actually what I said was, no, I'm a historian of the ancient world. And that ended the conversation right there. I was reading a book that was clearly about Jesus or Paul. So I think Jesus was in the same position. But I would not be surprised, honestly, if somebody at the time of Jesus took out of his pocket a silver denarius and said, well, that's what I think a son of God is like. Because son of God, David was a son of God, a chosen of God, an heir of God. I don't see a problem in that matrix, in that time, though I don't know what happened, with somebody saying, that's my idea of a Messiah. That's my Messiah guy. Yeah, and he's son of God too. That's what God looks like in sandals, as I said before. All of that is possible. But I think what Jesus is trying to do, though, is very important. He's asking them. What he's doing is being a community organizer. He's organizing community. So to put the emphasis, well, are you the Messiah or are you not the Messiah? And what's your program? What's your platform? Would do exactly what Jesus didn't want to do. Shift the emphasis to talk about him. So I take very seriously, for example, that he sends out his followers to do the same thing he's doing. He doesn't settle down at Nazareth and say, you guys go out and bring everyone to me. We set up a nice big healing shop here and everyone will be happy. He doesn't do that. He's on the road and his followers are on the road. So I think he is eschatological, if you want to use that word. I would say a modern word for eschatological. It simply comes, as you know, from the Greek word for last or end. What does the last stage of the earth look like? So we are clearly in that. I use the term post-civilization, since civilization seems to have disappointed us. I mean, it's seen better than barbarism before, since it seemed to control violence. And now we're afraid it didn't control it, it just channeled it into worse forms. So I use the term post-civilization for eschatology. Now, that's eschatology. That's the challenge of our species. I don't care what word you're using. The challenge of our species is not to let civilization destroy us, which we invented, of course. So that's eschatology. If you are an apocalyptic prophet is an eschatologist. Okay, let me put it this way. An apocalypticist is a prophet. I'm going to use it plural to avoid he and she. Apocalypticists are prophets who have lost their nerves. They're not convinced any longer they can see what God is up to in their tradition. We give up. We don't know what's going on. We don't even know how to tell anymore. We need somebody to come down from heaven and tell us what's going on. And someday now, God's going to do it. And all we can do is wait for it, pray for it, hope for it, expect it. That's apocalyptic eschatology. It's close to a loss of faith. It's certainly a loss of hope, and definitely a loss of nerve. And it's awfully close to giving up, which is not what those nonviolent resistors were doing, by the way. They hadn't given up. They had never decided, well, God will come down and take care of Caligula. So that's where I am.
Mm-hmm. Do you if people have listened to Homebrewed, the podcast, for a long time, I've had a whole bunch of different historical Jesus scholars on, and in one of the questioners sent in and had pulled quotes from like when Bart Ehrman was on, and when N.T. Wright was on, and Helen Bond was on, and all these individuals. And one of the things they noticed as a non-professional, though I always find Sandra's questions great, was how you negotiate thinking about the Gospels for getting at the historical Jesus changes dramatically how you then think the gospel should inform our theological reflection today. Sometimes, if you come with a ontological assumption about the nature of the person of Jesus, right, like then you're relating to the stories differently. If you come to them with a assumption that the gospels are not the kind of theological narratives that you emphasized in the Advent Stories class, then the way you think about Jesus's own self-understanding changes. And so the questioner raised a reference to when N.T. Wright was on, and I know that you and him have had quite the fun going back and forth over your careers, and it seems that for him, the Jesus's own self-consciousness about how he understood his relationship to God is of deep metaphysical importance. And how do you see what we have access to historically as permitting or allowing that kind of question? I think that so often if your own experience of the world is one where the divine's been mediated by Jesus, and then you turn to the history, like there are questions you're comfortable asking and finding possible solutions to that are different than when you're not. And it's so hard to kind of parse it, right? So like he talks about the role of Jesus internalizing the kind of apocalyptic Messiah through Second Esdras and this kind of thing, and then living out the vocation of the people of Israel and stuff like that. And there are a number of people in the class that kind of come out of literalism, right, via Tom's work at Engaging Critical Scholarship in the Faith. What are the kind of switches or hinge points that differentiate that kind of academic inquiry shaped by faith and like someone like yourself or Marcus and that kind of thing?
Okay, in the historical Jesus, that's 1991, I guess I have to think. 1991, yeah, just had its 30th anniversary. That book was written actually not for ordinary human beings. It was written for scholars in the hope of creating a discussion on methodology. And methodology is normally the kiss of death in a book. Nobody wants to talk about that. Let's get right into it. Let me give an example. My idea was leave the Gospels aside. Don't go into the Gospels and start like Tom does in the Gospels at all. Leave them aside and try and write, understand, conceptualize, internalize as thick a sociological description you can get of Antipas's Galilee in the 20s of the first century. Now, of course, I know that because that's Jesus's time, so I'm cheating a little bit. But I try to leave Jesus aside. Forget Jesus for a moment. What is Antipas up to? And then what is John the Baptist up to, and what is Jesus? And what I was convinced of what Antipas was up to in the 20s was the commercialization of the Sea of Galilee, in the hope that what he had failed to do under Augustus and would fail to do under Caligula, namely become king of the Jews like his father, would work. And his great big idea was to commercialize the lake, build a new capital, Tiberias, on the lake, call it after the emperor, of course, and get into the Roman Mediterranean globalization. That's what the Romans were into. We call it imperialism, fine, but it was Mediterranean globalization. You know, the fish would be salted, the fish would be dried, there'd be garum, it would go out through Tyre into the Mediterranean. All of that makes sense. So I set up that as thick as I can. Now, I may be cheating a little out of the corner of my eye. I'm asking why there's so much fishy stuff in the gospel. You know, why are all these first people ex-fisher people? Even Mary of Magdala comes from the major fishing village next to Tiberias. Probably not modern Magdala, but in any case. So I try to set up that first. Then I look at the Gospels. And what immediately jumps out at me is Jesus getting traction for the tradition about God's rule on the northwest quadrant of the Sea of Galilee in the 20s of the first century. And bango, that makes sense to me. Of course, that's where the action is. It's like saying, what did Martin Luther King do on the bridge that afternoon? He just happened to be there for a stroll. No, that's where the action is. So Jesus moves from Nazareth inland all the way to Capernaum because good old Antipas has moved from Sepphoris to Tiberias. And the action is now on that northwest quadrant of the Sea of Galilee in the 20s. You want to talk the kingdom of God to people who are ready to listen to it, because this is about God's fair rule of the world, and this ain't fair. What did we do that we can't launch our boats anymore, go down for a free protein additive to our meal? All of a sudden, it's like the commons is now under the government. It's like Robin Hood and Sherwood Forest. He can't shoot deer anymore. He's taken over the lake. Now, that makes sense to me. It makes sense to me why he moved there, why he changed his capital. So I don't want to begin with Jesus, because if I begin with Jesus, I'd be arguing, did he really say 9:1 that there's some, standing here who will not taste death before the Son of God, for to see the Son of Man coming in power? And then we'll go off into that, and we'll never get home. We get lost in that, and we argue. I try to start with the matrix. I mean, I love that word. Matrix is the root we get matter from. Mater in Greek, matter. It's the womb. It's like a womb analogy. A matrix is where life begins. It's where it happens. So I want to start there. I want to start with Antipas's Galilee. And that was the method I was trying to do. Then I would start and see what is the earliest stuff I can get about Jesus, and does he fit into that matrix? And if it doesn't, then I'd have to say, well, we've lost historical Jesus. I can tell you about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or Thomas, or somebody else, but Jesus is simply lost. I mean, the historical Jesus. He's been overlaid with so much interpretation, which is perfectly valid, nothing wrong with that. But as an individual, he's lost to legend. But that's not what I'm finding. I'm finding that it makes sense that he finds traction. You see what I mean by traction? If you think about Me Too or Black Lives Matter, there's moments of traction when a tradition can get moving. So I want to start there. If you start somewhere else, I'm going to try and pull you back there. So with Tom, for example, I have no idea if Jesus did half the stuff Tom says, but I want to start back there. I want to start with the Romanization of the homeland in Galilee in the 20s under Antipas. And there's more than enough. If you bother to look, there's more than enough, as we saw with the Galilee boat, remember?
Yeah. Yeah. And there are very different questions that centered around Paul. Some asking like, "Oh, Paul," and obviously there's no Christmas story that Paul seems really aware of, but also that as the earliest texts that we have from the Jesus movement and the way in which his leadership and shaping of it kind of ultimately ends up preserving, in some sense, the memory of Jesus. How do you see uh, their relationship when you compare it in the historical matrices and not necessarily the relationship as, I guess, normally seen when you just stick the letters right next to the Gospels
Yeah.
and you assume there's a kind of broad consensus in the New Testament?
I think actually that the most important thing about, well, let me back up. I think one of the most important things about Paul is that most of the New Testament doesn't like him. Really, I'm serious. I'm serious. And as you well know, there's at least 6 letters. I mean, this is again, scholars debate this, but at least there is consensus that 3 of the letters, Timothy and Titus, are probably, I'm going to say certainly not written by Paul, and Colossians and Ephesians, probably not. And they're all cleaning Paul up. And of course, Luke is the great big cleaner upper of Paul. So I keep asking, what gives with Paul that makes him needing so much damage control? Why is he more radical than most of the New Testament? Because that's what I think it is. Every time I see what Luke writes, it tones him down. Acts 15 tones down Galatians 1 and 2, for example. There wasn't really a fight. There wasn't really a fight. We had a lovely meeting and everyone loved one another. That's not what Paul says. So here's, I think, the clue to Paul. He was a Pharisee. Now we know that, right? He never stopped being a Pharisee. I think Paul is a messianic Pharisee because the Pharisees, 2 things we know about the Pharisees: fidelity to tradition, and then a little almost ironically in that, also the idea that at the end of time, there would be a universal resurrection of everyone for a final judgment in which we off go merrily to heaven or lastly to hell. Now, I don't believe for a second in any such thing, not for a second. I think it's almost, when you see people coming out of fish's mouth and all the rest of it, it's almost humorous. But despite the horrors that people like Dante give us, or Bruegel, wait a minute. Paul is telling us there is a cosmic justice to the world, that we don't get away with it. Now, of course, it's God's punishments, but let me take it out of God's punishments mitigated by God's forgiveness and our mercy and put it into human evolution. There are consequences. Forget punishments. There are consequences, not divine punishments, human consequences. And yes, there is forgiveness in the sense that we can change. We really can change. We may not want to do it or intend to do it, but unlike other species, we're able to figure it out and change. We can if we want to. And also there's the mercy that we have a time within which, before it's too late. There's a time before we can reverse what things we're doing, before it is too late to change. So I want to talk about Paul's vision of cosmic justice, not off there at the end of time in some kind of a theatrical scenario that nobody in the right mind would believe in literally, but going on right now in the world. In fact, Paul says that because he says the general resurrection began with Jesus, as you know, in 1 Corinthians 15. That's how he explains it. So it's actually going on right now, not as punishments at all, but as consequences. So I see that vision of Paul. In other words, he's still a Pharisee. He still believes I'm changing him from punishments to Pharisee to consequences. But my right to do it is that he says the general resurrection, his term is anastasis necron, the resurrection of the dead, begins with Jesus. Now, what exactly does that mean? I thought Jesus just came out because he was a good guy and God rewarded him by giving him a nice little personal resurrection. But there's no such a thing as a personal resurrection. Resurrection is always of the human race. So that's why the Eastern tradition has Adam and Eve coming out. Paul would be quite at home with that. And he wouldn't be at home with Jesus coming out, and hovering above the tomb at all. Paul would say, well, that's an essential. So I think Paul is profoundly in the tradition of Jesus, not just because, he translates God's will into language that Romans would understand, but because of his vision of a cosmic justice running the world. Even though, as I said, I don't for a second think of it in terms of punishments. But it doesn't bother me if somebody in the ancient world sees something important, like a poor person, falling dead in the street, and they say, well, God has struck the person dead. No, I presume it's a heart attack. So I will take their data, if you will, and change their interpretation. But I take seriously they might be seeing something. So I can read Paul, or Jesus for that matter, say, now they're seeing something. I don't think I can accept that interpretation, or I can no longer accept that interpretation. But I'm not going to dismiss that maybe they are seeing something we have to be careful about. So Paul, I'm really trying to explore at the moment, literally, what does it mean to take Paul as a messianic Pharisee? He's brought together his Pharisaic tradition and his new messianic tradition, and he's trying to imagine them together. And that's, nobody else is doing that in the whole New Testament. I'm not certain that it's possible that Matthew could be a Pharisee, but I'm not sure. He's a rabbi, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, so we have a little bit of time left, and there are some questions that are more standalone. I couldn't weave together the
you had a job.
All the emails. Now Elizabeth typed hers in, but she also emailed it, and she has a Koine font, I guess, on her computer.
Yeah, she got Greek too.
So this one is interesting. And for those that weren't a part of the Christmas stories class, Dom spent some time talking about the inn and such, which this question's a follow up on, looking at the relationship of the Caravan Inn, Luke's Christmas story, and its connection to the Easter story.
It just seems to me to be easier to understand, actually, Elizabeth. I think Kataluma, as you said, is the rentable room. That's what Jesus uses in Luke's story for the Last Supper, as you know. It's a rent room, a room for rent. Like we might go to a Holiday Inn or something and rent a room for a meeting or something like that. It's that type of a room. It's not an inn, but every inn would have such rooms. And the manger, why a manger? I mean, you could say, well, they went to I can't imagine that they went to a real house, and the house people said, fine, go out there with the animals. We won't let you into the house. Because first of all, the general house at that time is a courtyard house. It's possible. It's possible. If they went to a house with a courtyard, and in the courtyard, let's say they have equipment for the animals, and for privacy, they would give them that. But we're in the same thing. Basically, what you end up with is Jesus is born near the animals. Now, I think Luke is making it up. I think, which means it's more important. It's not just that's what happened. So I think he tells us a story in which he makes up the fact that Jesus is born and laid in in a manger close to animals. I think that's kind of precious. And it's draft animals too as well. But if you wanted to think, well, he went to a house, a courtyard house, of course, and in the courtyard of that house, there was a manger, of course, which is quite possible. And to give them privacy there, rather than she would do take it in with the whole family who are all kind of sleeping together, more or less. Perfectly possible. No way I could disprove it. I am primarily interested in no interpretation that says, see, these cruel Jews wouldn't even let a pregnant woman, they put her in an outhouse or something.
Yeah.
Or that they were so poor they just couldn't. So I don't think either of those are valid. Certainly not in Luke's mind. So that would be a fine translation.
So we'll try to do a few of these, do them on the quicker side. There are a couple of people that asked this. John did. Is there any evidence that Paul had access to any of the gospel sources?
No, I don't think so.
Do you think the kind of questions driving him have tension with some of the communities that the gospels come out of?
Oh yeah,
because you hinted at it in the Luke Acts conversation.
Definitely, and that's part of why there's so much antagonism to Paul, even in the New Testament, without going outside the New Testament. But even within the New Testament itself, you see, Paul wrote, so they can't get rid of him. If Paul hadn't written and just been an oral teacher like Jesus, we'd probably never have heard of him. He'd been washed out of the tradition. But he's in there. The letters are there. People have got it. There's enough people for him. But everything is to tone him down, de-radicalize him, make him ready for Constantine, as it were. So I think we have to explain, why is he so radical?
That makes sense. So here's a fun one from Sophia. How do you view the relationship between Jesus, John the Baptist, and also James, the brother of Jesus, John and James' importance in the Jesus movement? There were bits of it that came out in comparing Jesus and John in the Christmas stories, the role John the Baptist plays in his arrest signaling the beginning of his ministry. We get the Josephus references you brought up briefly about James and the brother of Jesus. How do you see that network of relations?
Okay, I mean, James is so important, as you know, in 62 when he was put to death during an interregnum, when the governor or the sub-governor wasn't there. He was put to death by the high priest from the house of Annas, and they toppled the high priest for doing that. When did James get to Jerusalem? Was James in Jerusalem long before Jesus was crucified? Did James have his own little community, kind of like urban Essenes in Jerusalem before Jesus even? He certainly had it after Jesus, and I think he was an ascetic. There's enough tradition for that. And if you're really ascetic, you're pretty much kosher. There's nothing as kosher as bread and water. So I think he was probably in certain circles maybe more important than Jesus. He was sort of what you might call the model church. I don't know if he's the mother church, but the model church of communities. I think Luke got that one right, who shared what they have, at least to a certain extent. So I think James was terribly important. John the Baptist and Jesus, I think Jesus converted, I used that term deliberately before, from being a follower of John the Baptist after the death of John the Baptist to hold a different view of God, a different view of God's rule. But it took John's life and John's death to have Jesus change, to become the Jesus that we know, who's saying, as I understand it, that God is waiting for us to cooperate with God, and we're waiting for God to do it for us. And that's why nothing has happened. And that's as close as I can to quote Jesus.
Mm-hmm. All right. Here is a question from Josh Scott, who, by the way, if anyone is in Nashville, is a minister at the kind of progressive Christian community that loves to hang out with John Dominic Crossan. So if you're in Nashville, check him out. But what does Dr. Crossan think about the idea that Holy Week is more liturgy than history, that Jesus' final week might have been a longer period, say from Tabernacles to Passover?
To be honest with you, it's a sort of question I don't want to get into because I don't know if we can get anywhere with it. Here's the way I work with it. I take it as historically right that Jesus was crucified around Passover for other reasons. Then I kind of work backwards. I have to know a question I asked of earlier. What happened this time that never happened any other time? Why did he go to Jerusalem that time if he only went once, If he went regularly, why did something happen this time? So I'm trying to figure that out. I think what happened, it's my best guess, is he's invited by supporters, come up to Jerusalem to take your message out of those rinky-dinky little villages of Galilee, come where it's real, up here to the capital of your people at Passover, when people are going all across the world, the Roman world. That's the time to begin. You'll be safe. There's enough people up here, the crowd in Mark, who will protect you during the day, and then get out of Jerusalem every night to Bethany. Now, all of that makes sense. Maybe it's just because Mark's a heck of a good writer, but I don't get the idea that he knows what he's doing when he's telling me that Jesus came guaranteed that you'll be safe, as it were. And he is until Wednesday, and he almost gets away with it because finally they have decided we can't risk a riot. We'll let him get home and out of here before we cause a riot. So he could have got away with it. He almost got away with it. I think that's what really was happening. So I don't want to argue much more could have gone on because I'm afraid the whole thing will just drifted to the start with the fact he got crucified and try and work out from that when, why, where, how, when, as close as possible to facts that we're clear about. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't disprove the other.
Yeah. So, what role do you see in the in kind of the ritual life or the liturgical life of the early church shaping the way we tell the stories, be it like a practice like baptism or Eucharist, or like even how you think through how those regular enactments that centered cultic life in the early Jesus communities lead to the rhythm of worship and our theological reflection as a church about it?
Well, I mean, in one sense, I'm really dependent on Paul. That's the only place I get a glimpse of baptism, what the ritual involved in Paul and the Eucharist, especially with the Corinthians messing it up. That's the only place I can really see it down close. But there's a continuity with baptism, for example. Paul says, you've died with Christ. Jesus was put to death by Roman values. Now, says Paul, by baptism, you're going down into the grave with Jesus, as it were, and you are dying to Roman values, also known as treason, of course. But you're dying to Roman values. So maybe 400 years later, when finally Christians, for the first time, get to build baptismal sites, I'm avoiding the term font, lo and behold, they're dug into the ground like graves, and they're cruciform. You can see one in St. John's in near Ephesus, still there. Or they're built up like a coffin-shaped sarcophagus. So Christians literally get into a grave or into a coffin to be baptized. Now we say they're reborn, and isn't that lovely? Yeah, they're reborn. That means they ain't Romans anymore. But that's serious business. That would be like somebody saying today that when you're baptized, you're no longer an American. Okay, you're giving up American values. Yeah. What about your passport? What about your driving license? I mean, these are serious questions for first Christians. What did it mean to be born again in the grave of Jesus, as it were? So I can understand how it gets from Pauline theology here to the first grave sites, the first extant baptismal sites we get And that's usually pretty much by the 400s. Now, in the Eucharist, the interesting thing is that when a person dies, body and soul are separated. If body and blood are separated, that means you've been put to death, or you've had at least a fatal, something. So the Eucharist is ritually absorbing the bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ. That means the crucifixion of Christ. That means that you are publicly committing yourself to the same life of justice with food, bread and wine, bread and fish in Galilee, that Jesus did, even if it costs your own life. Bread and body and blood, body and blood, not body and soul. Body and soul is you die at peace in your own bed. Body and blood is you die by force. So the rituals of both of those, insofar as you can see them, and we can see them relatively clearly in Paul because people are having trouble with them. That's the only reason we know anything in Paul, because somebody is arguing with him. You can see those two very clearly in Paul.
Well, Dom, the most popular thing in all of the emails were variations of gratitude. And I mean, individuals who've had a long relationship with you, to people like Samantha I mentioned earlier, who just discovered you. So on behalf of all those affirmations, you've been a lot to me, my whole intellectual journey. But Nick, a Southern Baptist minister, said this, and this can be the thank you moment
Okay.
on behalf of all of us of any part of the church and out of it. Nick said, longtime Southern Baptist minister and John Dominic Crossan fan in secret. I may have a very different idea about different parts of the biblical text or what I affirm about God or miracles and such, but there's been no New Testament scholar that's helped me take Jesus' ministry and the challenge of faith more seriously. So thank you, Dom.
Oh, that's lovely. That's that could make me cry very
So
easily.
It's been a joy to get to do this. I'm so pumped we get to do it with the Easter stories. And anyone who wants to join this listening, watching live, been in the class, or gets the email later, you can head to easterwithcrossan.com and join up. We got lots of thank yous in the chat, but it's a real joy. And knowing we are going to be talking about the Easter stories, I saved the questions you all sent specifically to that for then. But we're going to have fun. So remember, when you sign up, we will deliver the visual lectures right at the beginning of Lent, so that you can use them in a group or individually how you want. And then we'll have live Q&As much like this, where what I'll do is pull the questions around themes so we can dig into particular topics each time. And you can send in questions from your group. You can send them on your own. And hopefully it will enable people who like all of you that have used it in your group and shared, can invite people into the journey and such. So feel free to share it. And remember, the class is donation based, including zero. So feel free to invite a friend to join along. That might be more like Samantha and never really taken the text seriously and thinking about our evolutionary matrix and the challenge of violence. And maybe you have a Southern Baptist minister who sneaks their Jesus seminar legend on the side, like Nick, or people in between, like myself. But it's been a complete joy, Dom, and I know. I hope you're noticing on the screen all the thank yous, but it is quite a treat to get to experience the fruit of so many years of your faithful wrestling with the text and asking the text to help us wrestle with the big questions facing us as not just a particular theological community, but a species that is learning, hopefully, how to cooperate and thrive.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you very, very much, Trip, for everything you set up. This technology is fabulous.
Oh, I enjoyed doing it. So until next time, we will see you all again soon. EasterWithCrossan.com. And everyone that's already signed up, once I finish, you'll get an email very soon about how to access all the info. But I'm a little behind from spending the day with a busted tire. Anyway. So bye for now.